Lecture 17. He, she, it. Third-person point of view.
It's not like I've done a survey or anything, but I think it's safe to say that some version of the third person is the default narrative voice of most contemporary fiction. With the rise of the memoir in recent years, the first person has given the third person a run for its money. But on the whole, most writers probably feel most comfortable writing in the third person. Why should this be, I wonder? As I said at the beginning of the previous lecture, a first-person narration can seem more natural, and it can certainly be appealing, intimate, and immediate, providing the illusion that we are hearing the events of the story from one of its participants, or at least from a witness. But as I also pointed out, first-person narrators can be deluded, or they can be liars. There is also another drawback which is common to nearly all first-person narrators, whether they're telling the truth or not. A first-person narrator can usually talk only about the events that he or she has witnessed or has heard about from another source. In addition, the first-person narration can be tricky for a writer because of that double consciousness that I explained in the last lecture. You have a slightly more complicated job when you're writing in the first person. You are not only telling the story, you are also creating an important character at the same time and telling the story through that character's voice. The third person, on the other hand, has a good deal more range and flexibility than the first person. A third-person narration can encompass all sorts of things that a first-person narrator wouldn't know or be able to express. The third person can also, paradoxically, go deeper into an individual character's consciousness than the first person can. If you adopt the godlike perspective of the omniscient third person, for example, every facet of a character's personality and history is made available to the reader. But perhaps most importantly, the third person is probably a more instinctive and natural way to tell a fictional story, especially if you're telling a story about someone who isn't yourself, as most fiction writers are. Most of us tell jokes in the third person. Nearly all fairy tales and folk tales are told in the third person. No one says, "Once upon a time, I went into the woods to my grandmother's house." And many of the great early texts of Western literature are told in the third person, from the Iliad and the Odyssey to Beowulf and Don Quixote. In its most straightforward form, the third person adopts the easy cadence and authority of the traditional oral storyteller. But of course, there are different varieties and flavors of the third person. Think back to my metaphor of the sky from my first lecture about point of view. I started at the zenith with the most omniscient variety of the third person and worked my way down the curve of the sky to the interior version of the first person on the ground level. In this lecture, we're going to look at the varieties of the third person in more detail. I will start with the type of third-person narration that is most like the first person and work my way back up to the godlike third person of the great 19th century novelists. What we'll find by the end, spoiler alert, is that most writers usually adopt more than one variety of the third person in the same story or novel. This is different from the way writers tend to use the first person, where you are often locked into one version of the narration throughout the entire story. So, let's start with the close third person, or what is sometimes called free indirect discourse. At the start of this lecture, I said that the third person is the default mode of most contemporary fiction, and the close third person is the type that is most commonly used. In the close third person, you adopt the point of view of only one character at a time, while continuing to use the third-person pronouns he or she. It's very similar to the first person on the whole, because the close third person sticks to what the character knows. It shows us only what that character has seen or heard about, and it shows us only that character's thoughts and feelings. In fact, the close third person traffics in that same double consciousness that the first person does, only with more weight being given to the exterior point of view of the author. In some instances, this kind of third person is so close to the character that it ends up being a de facto first person. In fact, in some uses of the close third person, you could probably switch the narrative into the first person without having to change too much apart from the pronouns. But that's rare. In most cases, the close third person at least contains the possibility of going deeper into the character's head than a simple first-person narration does. This is because the third person allows you to reveal things about the character's thoughts, feelings, intentions, and prejudices that the character himself may not know or understand. A close third person can also reveal the character's secrets. In this respect, the close third person can be more comprehensive than the first person. It allows you to show everything about a character and not just what the character chooses to reveal. As with any other choice in creative writing, choosing to use this particular point of view means you gain some things and you lose some things. In the first person, you can create a unique voice for the character, the way Twain does for Huck Finn. By choosing to tell the story in the close third person, you lose that distinctive voice. On the other hand, in the close third person, you can dive as deeply into your character's head as Virginia Woolf does in Mrs. Dalloway. Let's take a look at the difference. That moment in Huckleberry Finn where Huck decides to help Jim win his freedom would not be nearly as thrilling in the close third person. The power of that scene comes from watching Huck work it out for himself. If you were to change that passage into the third person, you'd have to pepper it with a lot of phrases like, Huck thought that, or it seemed to Huck that. And right there, you lose the immediacy of it. You lose the feeling that you're watching Huck Finn himself wrestling with his own conscience. At last, Huck decided, all right then, he'd go to hell, is not nearly as powerful a sentence as Huck himself saying, all right then, I'll go to hell. Now think back to that moment in Mrs. Dalloway that I mentioned in an earlier lecture, when Clarissa Dalloway is looking at a shop window. In just a few words, her mind skips with lightning speed from a memory of her father buying suits, to a shop where you could buy perfect gloves, to her uncle saying that you could know a lady by her gloves, to the death of her uncle during the war, to her own passion for gloves, and finally to her remote relationship with her daughter. It's possible to imagine recasting that scene in the first person, but think how clumsy it would be. As I stared in the window of a shop where you used to be able to buy almost perfect gloves, I was reminded of my Uncle William saying that you could know a lady by her shoes and gloves, which reminded me of how he turned over in his bed one morning and died, and so on. Not only is this horribly awkward, it actually changes Mrs. Dalloway as a character. It makes her a much more introspective and self-aware woman than she is in Woolf's version. It presumes that she understands her own thoughts as well as her author does. Instead, by using a very close, very intimate third person in that scene, we're getting an unself-conscious view of Clarissa Dalloway. We're seeing her intimately, but remotely at the same time. We understand her even better than she could understand herself. Let me put it this way. The close third person is like eavesdropping. We're more likely to believe what a politician says when he doesn't know the microphone is on than when he's wearing his public face and repeating his talking points. The close third person is like an open mic. It lays bare the private Mrs. Dalloway, not just the version of herself that she wants the world to see. Another reason the close third person is more flexible and comprehensive than the first person is that it's easier to shift point of view from one character to another. It's certainly possible to switch from one first-person narrator to another within the same story or book. William Faulkner does it brilliantly in As I Lay Dying, which is narrated by 15 different characters. It's a remarkable achievement, but before you rush off to imitate it, consider this. When you're writing in the first person, you're not only telling the story, you're creating an individual voice for that character. In Faulkner's case, that's 15 different narrators. And even though they all come from the same family, or at least from the same community, they all have to sound at least a little bit different from each other. It's a lot of work, both for the writer and the reader, which is perhaps why this technique isn't used very often. On the other hand, in the close third person, you can switch from one character to another with relative ease, because you don't have to reinvent the voice of the narration itself each time you switch point of view. You can use the same authorial voice to evoke different characters. Mrs. Dalloway is a bravura example of this, of course, often switching point of view within a scene. However, in most instances, writers shift point of view from chapter to chapter. This technique broadens the scope of the story beyond what only one character can know. I learned this the hard way when I was writing my first published novel, The Wild Colonial Boy. That novel was a thriller about a young Irish-American named Brian, who agrees to carry some explosives into Britain for an Irish terrorist. My first 3 drafts were in the close third person from Brian's point of view. The problem was that in each successive draft, the plot became more complicated. It reached a point where many of the most dramatic moments, a gunfight, a brutal interrogation, a terrorist bombing, happened when Brian wasn't present. This was supposed to be a thriller, and yet the most thrilling scenes entered the novel only as second-hand accounts or news reports. Finally, a friendly agent who agreed to read the 3rd draft suggested that I tell the novel from the alternating points of view of Brian and several other characters in the novel. That way I could show the reader each dramatic moment from the point of view of one of the characters who was actually present, instead of just feebly telling the reader about them later on from Brian's second-hand perspective. This suggestion opened up the book, gave it a much wider scope, and made it much more thrilling. It also forced me to get inside the heads of 3 more characters, 2 of whom were women, which was something I might never have attempted on my own. And so I learned that alternating points of view in the close third person is a really powerful way to tell a long story or a novel. It gives you the best of both worlds. Each individual chapter allows you to inhabit the mind of a single character, but by changing the point of view with each subsequent chapter, you can broaden the scope of your narrative. In fact, by using several different point of view characters, you can show different perspectives on the same event. And at the most mechanical level, you can make sure the reader is present at all the most important scenes. Switching between several point of view characters with the close third person is an especially useful technique for very long, epic narratives. It can balance intimacy with a sort of widescreen cinematic expansiveness. George R.R. Martin uses this technique very effectively in his Song of Ice and Fire novels. Each book is told from the points of view of many different characters, and the point of view switches with each chapter. Not only does this allow the reader to see the complex events of the story from multiple points of view, it allows Martin to evoke a vast imaginary world in vivid and evocative detail. And by showing different and often competing perspectives on the same series of events, the series reads less like a simplistic fable of good versus evil, and more like a gritty contemporary account of conflicting interests. Martin also does something else that many writers do when using the close third person. He includes the point of view character's thoughts in the first person, but within the third person narration. Usually these thoughts are set off from the rest of the narration by italics. Here's the character Jaime Lannister, as he's being ferried down a river in a rowboat as a captive in chains, and he's trying to catch a little sleep on the fly. He must have drifted off. The wine had made him sleepy, and it felt good to stretch, a luxury his chains had not permitted him in his cell. Jaime had long ago learned to snatch sleep in the saddle during a march. This was no harder. Then, in italics, Tyrion is going to laugh himself sick when he hears how I slept through my own escape. Then, back to Roman type. He was awake now, though, and the fetters were irksome. When it's done seamlessly, as it is here, this can add yet another dimension to the close third person. And some writers, such as Leo Tolstoy and Anna Karenina, set their characters' thoughts in quotation marks rather than italics, using she thought or she said to herself, rather than the usual dialogue tag, she said. Other writers incorporate the first-person thoughts of a character without using italics or quotation marks. The entirety of my novel Next is told from the close third-person point of view of a single character named Kevin. Before publication, I had a friendly disagreement with the copy editor who wanted to put Kevin's first-person thoughts in italics. Because the whole book was essentially in Kevin's head, I was afraid that all those italics would simply be distracting, so I insisted on leaving his thoughts in Roman type. Now let's take a quick look at another variety of the third person, namely the objective or remote third person. This is the sort of third-person narration that simply describes what the characters do and say without giving the reader access to their thoughts. At first glance, this kind of narration might seem the same as the recording I first person I talked about in the last lecture, in which a character who is tangential to the main story tells the events of the narrative the way Ishmael and Nick Carraway do. But there's a crucial difference. With the recording I first person, the events are still being filtered through a fictional consciousness. And this fictional consciousness often passes judgment or makes educated guesses as to what the other characters are thinking. Nick Carraway may not be central to The Great Gatsby, but he does narrate the story of Gatsby and Daisy from a particular point of view. Nick's take on the events of the novel still colors the reader's understanding. Compare this with the remote third-person narration in Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. This narrative perspective watches everything the characters do like a camera, but without giving us direct access to their thoughts and feelings. Here's a moment when Sam Spade is embracing his partner's wife. He's been carrying on an affair with her, and this excerpt comes from the moment when they have found out that his partner and her husband is dead. He grimaced again and bent his head for a surreptitious look at the watch on his wrist. His left arm was around her, the hand on her left shoulder. His cuff was pulled back far enough to leave the watch uncovered. It showed 10:10. The woman stirred in his arms and raised her face again. Her blue eyes were wet, round, and white-ringed. Her mouth was moist. "Oh, Sam," she moaned, "did you kill him?" Spade stared at her with bulging eyes. His bony jaw fell down. He took his arms from her and stepped back out of her arms. He scowled at her and cleared his throat. Now, it's pretty clear from this that Spade may be a heartless cad, but he's probably not a murderer. And since we don't know what he's actually thinking, we can't be absolutely certain. This kind of third person keeps us at arm's length from its characters. This builds suspense and keeps the reader on his toes, but at the cost of a certain coldness. The opposite of this remote and non-committal third person is what you might call the engaged or judgmental third person. Even though this variety of the third person is not tied to a character in the story, the voice still has a strong opinion about the events it is relating. You find this type of third person much more commonly in the novels of the 18th and 19th centuries, when authors had no problem passing judgment on the follies of their characters. There is no pretense of objectivity in the narrative voice, which passes judgment right and left without filtering it through a character. This kind of voice works especially well with comic or picaresque novels, like those of the 18th century English writer Henry Fielding. His big comic novel Tom Jones regularly passes judgment on the follies of its characters. A generation later, you still hear something of the same voice in Jane Austen, who was a much more subtle writer than Henry Fielding, but also a very sharp judge of flawed characters. Much of Pride and Prejudice is told in the close third person from Elizabeth Bennet's point of view, but there are also memorable passages in which the author herself passes a direct and unmediated judgment. Here's a paragraph from the first chapter, which sums up the badly mismatched marriage of Elizabeth's parents, even before we have met any of their daughters. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. If this is a bit too 19th century for you, let me translate. Mr. Bennet is a quick-witted, intelligent man who keeps his opinions to himself and hides behind his sarcasm. Mrs. Bennet is uneducated and not very intelligent, and she loves gossip and is terrified that her daughters will not marry well. Jane Austen is telling us rather bluntly that this is not a match made in heaven. Perhaps the most enthusiastically judgmental narrator of all time is Charles Dickens. His third-person narration often has great fun at the expense of his characters, and it also doesn't shy away from stern moral outrage. In the opening pages of one of his greatest novels, Bleak House, Dickens is already passing judgment before he has introduced any characters at all, when he describes at length the baleful effect of a complicated Chancery Court lawsuit. Jarndyce and Jarndyce drones on. This scarecrow of a suit has, in the course of time, become so complicated that no man alive knows what it means. The parties to it understand it least, but it has been observed that no two Chancery lawyers can talk about it for 5 minutes without coming to a total disagreement as to all the premises. Innumerable children have been born into the cause. Innumerable young people have married into it. Innumerable old people have died out of it. Scores of persons have deliriously found themselves made parties in Jarndyce and Jarndyce without knowing how or why. Whole families have inherited legendary hatreds with the suit, and so on. Dickens being Dickens, this goes on for several pages. Modern writers are no less opinionated than Dickens, of course, but they usually don't tell the reader what to think. Instead, most contemporary novelists prefer to stand back and let the events of the novel and the actions of the characters speak for themselves, often while discreetly stacking the deck. Still, there are some modern novelists, such as John Irving and Tom Wolfe, who sometimes use their third-person narrative voice to pass an overt judgment. Let's move now up to the zenith of my imaginary dome, to the omniscient third person. This is the magisterial point of view of the great 19th century novelists such as George Eliot and Leo Tolstoy. This version of the third person is often described as godlike, but not just because it allows the writer complete access to the world she has created and the inner lives of her characters. Every writer already has that power, of course, no matter what point of view she's using. The omniscient third person is called godlike, rather, because it presents the reader the full range of perspectives, from the most all-encompassing view of a community to the most intimate exchange between two individuals to a character's most private thoughts. The hallmark of this kind of third-person narration, especially in the hands of a great writer like George Eliot, is that it can swoop in a single chapter, and sometimes in a single passage, from the widest view of the story to the most intimate. A good example of this kind of narrative dexterity is Chapter 11 of Eliot's Middlemarch. This is a huge Victorian novel with a lot of characters and a lot of story to tell, and it's set in a small fictional English community called Middlemarch in the 1830s. The whole of Chapter 11 is about 3,500 words, and in the first 1,300 words, Eliot directly tells us about a doctor named Lydgate. Dr. Lydgate is new to the town, and he is interested in marrying a very pretty young woman named Rosamund Vincy. Over the course of the passage, Eliot tells us bluntly that Lydgate is young, poor, and ambitious. She also tells us that the chief quality he wants in a wife is beauty and charm, which is why he has already ruled out the novel's main character, Dorothea Brooke, because Dorothea is too brainy and serious. Eliot also simply tells us that Rosamund Vincy is likewise interested in Lydgate because he is a handsome and accomplished outsider, and because she considers herself too good for the boring young men of Middlemarch. In this long passage of pure exposition, Eliot masterfully fits Lydgate and Rosamund within the social hierarchy of the town, and she also takes time to show how love and marriage can disarrange that social hierarchy. Her perspective in the first section of Chapter 11 is as godlike as possible. It is cool and even-handed and remote, with a few flashes of authorial judgment in the manner of Jane Austen or Henry Fielding. Then, in the second part of the chapter, Eliot deftly narrows her focus from the general to the particular. She focuses on the breakfast table conversation of Rosamund's family on a particular morning. We get to watch Rosamund, her brother Fred, and their mother bantering about Rosamund's marriage prospects, the rules of social class in their community, and Fred's opinion of Lydgate, among other things. It's one of my favorite scenes in all of literature because Eliot does so many things at once and does them so well. At the same time as she vividly evokes each individual character and shows their complicated relationships with each other, she also takes care of an important moment in the plot and gives the reader information that will be important later on. And it's all done in a third person that is halfway between a recording I and the more judgmental third person Eliot was using in the first half of the chapter. The only variety of the third person she doesn't use is the close third person, allowing us to see the scene strictly from inside the mind of Fred, Rosamund, or their mother. Eliot very effectively places us in the room with these characters. She allows us to witness each twist and turn of their conversation and to watch their body language. But with the reserve of the 19th century novelist, she does not encourage us to see through the eyes of any of the characters in the scene, or even to identify with any one of them. Which is not to say that an omniscient third-person narration can't incorporate the close third person as well. In Anna Karenina, which was published only a few years after Middlemarch, Tolstoy writes much of the novel in the same magisterial, omniscient third person that Eliot uses, and he keeps us at a slight remove from the characters. But at certain points in the novel, especially with Anna herself, and with another character named Levin, he also delves into a close third person that seems very contemporary to a modern reader. In the famous climax of the book, when Anna rushes about Moscow in a panic before her fateful encounter with a locomotive, the novel delves deep into her mind, mixing her first-person thoughts with an extremely intimate, close third person. The omniscient third person of the rest of the novel keeps us at arm's length from these Russian aristocrats, but in this passage, the distance between the reader and the character is almost completely erased. Anna's pain and desperation are visceral, and whether you approve of her choices or not, you can't read about her fate without a racing pulse. Modern writers, of course, have all of these techniques at their disposal. While it may be true that the close third person remains the default mode for many writers, you'll also find that most writers feel free to mix and match the varieties of the third person in surprising and innovative ways. The contemporary American crime novelist George Pelecanos stands in direct line of descent from Dashiell Hammett and Elmore Leonard. And like Hammett and Leonard, much of his narration is of the recording I variety. In very spare language, Pelecanos gives us detailed descriptions of what his characters look like, what they wear, and what they say and do. His novel The Cut, for example, is told mostly from the point of view of a young private investigator in Washington, D.C., named Spiro Lucas. Much of the story follows Spiro closely as he gets involved in a complicated case involving drug dealers. But occasionally, the narration varies from the remote third person into the close third person. In this passage, for example, Spiro, in the manner of all warm-blooded private detectives, is leaving the home of a woman named Lisa Weitzman, with whom he has just had a one-night stand. His father had once told him, "Don't let anything walk past you," and Lucas knew well what that meant. There are opportunities that are there for only a short period of time and only available to people of a certain age. He and Lisa Weitzman understood. They'd had fun. He didn't want to be one of those sad middle-aged guys who think about the women they should have bedded in their youth if only they'd been less sensible. He planned to age with good memories. This is one of the rare moments in the book when we get direct access to Spiro's thoughts and feelings, but in the context of a detective thriller, it's enough. What's even more interesting, however, is that Pelecanos himself very occasionally steps in to pass judgment on his character in the 19th century manner. Here's Spiro not long after his one-night stand, delivering a bunch of roses to Lisa's door. He went up the steps of Lisa Weitzman's home and laid the roses, heavily wetted, on her doorstep, along with a note he had written in a childish scrawl before getting out of his vehicle. The note was corny and obvious, something about how nice it was to hang out with her. He had no plans to try and see her again, but he wanted to do something respectful for her, at least. Flowers had come to mind. He was a resourceful, but not particularly original young man. Much of the judgment in this paragraph is implicit, the childish scrawl of the note, its corny and obvious wording, but there's a stinger in the tail of the paragraph. Like George Eliot passing bemused judgment on Dr. Lydgate's distaste for brainy women, Pelecanos himself briefly steps in to let us know that Spiro still has some growing up to do. Little moments like this help to make it clear that the author doesn't necessarily endorse everything his protagonist does. You can do this in the first person only by implication, but in the third person, you can come right out and say what you think. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about the various ways setting can be used in fiction, and we'll be looking at some famous bits of scene setting from Dickens' Bleak House and The Lord of the Rings, as well as some different uses of setting from Mr. Pelecanos and the British writer Rosemary Sutcliffe. In the meantime, here's an exercise that explores some of the power and flexibility of the third person. Pick a stressful or contentious situation between two characters, such as an argument between a husband and wife, or an interrogation scene where a cop is trying to get a confession out of a suspect. Then, tell the scene 3 different ways, each in the third person. Once in the close third person from the point of view of one character, the cop for example, and then tell the same situation again in the close third person from the point of view of the suspect. Then, in the third paragraph, try to go all George Eliot and look on the scene from the omniscient third person, showing the same situation again from a godlike perspective.